In Python, there are a couple of good guidelines that we should follow to help improve the quality and legibility of the programs that we write. So here we look at some of those standard guidelines when you're writing your first few programs. The first thing is, when you define a variable, you really should use a descriptive name. So we'll give some examples of what they look like. A variable should always start with a lowercase, if possible, or sometimes an undercase, an underscore character. So that's how we start off defining a variable. And it's also a good way to recognize them in our code. We're not allowed to put spaces in a variable name, and we'll just show that as an example. But we can use a thing called camel case. And camel case is a way of writing the name of a variable such that it's easy to read, because sometimes variable names can be reasonably long. When it comes to constants, we should always use uppercase. And if you see an uppercase variable, we know this is constant, and it means that as a programmer, I'm kind of making a promise to the rest of the code that I will not be changing the value inside that variable, this constant value. And of course, we should always use comments in our programs just to make sure when we go back and look at our code that we can read them and that it made sense and it was structured in a coherent way as we were writing our programs, especially if we're not the only person involved in writing those programs. Okay, let's have a look at some very basic standards that you would expect to see in any normal Python programming. And the very first thing is that you should always remember to comment your programs when you're actually writing them. And it's important to put comments in at the top of a program just to say maybe what the program should be doing, and then throughout the code in terms of the lines of code that you're using. When people write code, there's a tendency to think that they'll always remember the details because it's fresh in their mind at the moment. But when they go back and look at complex programs, or they share program development with someone, this can be extremely difficult. So this is the top of my program. This is an example of good style. So that's all this program is going to be about. So let's define some constants. So the first thing is I want to have an area in my program all about constants. So define constants here. So my first constant, when we define a constant, we should use uppercase. So this could be something like bottle size. We may have a standard bottle size that we're trying to refer, and that size may be 10, whatever that means. But when I see bottle size in uppercase like this, I'll know it's a constant. I could have the max size of something, and that could be equal to 100. So we could increase a bottle size up to a maximum, just say of 100. Now, if I want to define some variables to use, I usually would initialize those. So I want to define variables here. And using the camel notation, if I want to say, let's just say, we're still talking about a bottle, but in this case, we have a bottle that will have variable width. So the bottle width may be changed, and that could be equal to 6 or 3 or some other number that we want to use. So here we're using the camel notation, which means that we have a variable that starts with a lowercase, and if we change the word in the middle of it, we have uppercase. It's easier to read, it's more visual, and we know it's a variable because we started with lowercase. We know these are constants because they have uppercase. Now I can go back and I can also add in comments here and say these are constants, and this one here is also a constant, and here we have a variable. So we can have comments at the top and take over a full line, or at the end of a line, just to say that we have more information that we want to explain to the person who comes back and read this code later. These are very simple but very basic and very important practices when you're using variables and constants in your code.